God attempts through his word and through nature to remind us and impress on us the fact that his thoughts are so different and so far above our own. He uses illustrations, and in this text in Isaiah 55, the simile, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And we're going to come back to that idea in a few moments. The date was May 6, 1954, and there was an expectant crowd. They had gathered for what they hoped would be an historic event. You see, up to this point in time, no one had managed to achieve this feat. And the young 25-year-old man didn't have the time to train that he wished he had have had to train, because he was working as a junior doctor and there were some long hours involved. And as he neared the finishing strip, he could hear the roar and the cry of the crowd behind him in that overcast Oxford morning in the UK. And as he crossed the finish line, the announcer went to announce to the crowd the time. And all everyone could hear was the word 3. And then everyone started cheering, and they didn't hear the rest. But the rest was 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds, the very first man to run the mile in under 4 minutes. And he has gone down in history, and certainly far from now the only one. He went on, for those of you who may be familiar with his life, to become one of the leading neurologists in the UK. And when interviewed about his life, he feels his biggest accomplishment in life was not breaking the 4-minute mile, but the research that he had done in the area of neurology. What really interests me, however, I have to admit to you, is not so much the feat of what he accomplished, but what happened afterwards. Because leading up to this event, there were people who would say, we're not sure if humans really are capable of running that fast. We're not really sure if it's humanly possible. And for years and years, people had been trying to do it. But interesting that as soon as one person had achieved it, everyone realized it was possible. And within 46 days, someone else had broken the same record. And I want to use this term in a sense that it's not normally used, and that's the term glass ceiling. It's like leading up to that event. For many people, there was this glass ceiling. This perhaps cannot be achieved. And one man shows it can be achieved, and suddenly that ceiling is broken, and others believe. And when others believe, others act differently, and it influences behavior. And listen to some of the records that have come since that time. Jim Ryan, USA, 10 years later, became the first high school student to break the 4-minute mile. John Walker, the great New Zealand runner, was the first person to run under 3 minutes and 50 seconds, the first person to run 100 sub 4-minute miles. Of course, Steve Scott from USA holds the record with 1:36. How about Eamon Coolan, the Irish runner, the first person over 40 to run under 4 minutes? Daniel Coleman, Kenya, first to run 2 miles in under 8 minutes, doubled the feat. And the Norwegian runner Jakob, who was the youngest person ever, 16 years, 250 days. And you may have seen on the news, I don't know whether it was beginning of this year or end of last year, an Australian high school runner, 16 years old, only missed out on the record by a few days, was slightly older than the Norwegian runner. But suddenly now this benchmark is seen as achievable once one person breaks through that barrier. Let me give you another example. For a number of years, people had been trying to conquer Everest. And some people, if you look at the writings of some of the sports journalists prior to this time, some of them said, look, we don't think the human body can actually do it. We think this is beyond the limit of endurance. And so it was that it made big news. 1953, 29th of May, when the Kiwi Hillary and his offsider Tenzing made it to the top. Actually, did I mention, Wayne, that he was a Kiwi? I just wanted to make sure I didn't leave anything important out. But again, what really interested me was what happens in the years following this event. Because people now know it can be done. That glass ceiling has been broken and people say, this is achievable. And so listen to some of the records that have come. It actually did take 3 years for the next person to make it to the top. First female ascent, 1975. First ascent without supplemental oxygen, 1978. How about this? First ascent by a blind climber, 2001. How old do you think the youngest person was to reach the top? Have a guess. 13 years, 10 months. Most time to reach the summit, this made the news last year in May. Camel Rita Sherpa climbed it for the 26th time, May 2022. How about the oldest man to climb to the top? This guy's a bit of a legend. He climbed it at age 80. People are discounting it a bit because he actually didn't walk down. They extracted him from the top. But I still think that's an amazing feat. He said that he was going to come back at age 90. He's just turned 90. So I'm watching to see. He wants to be the first 90-year-old to climb it. So any retired people here wondering what to do, just don't. Maybe start with something a little smaller. He describes his diet as healthy eating and organic food. Just in case you need his diet, he starts every day with a breakfast of cooked rice, fermented soya bean, miso soup, eggs and fish. So I don't know if there's anything there at all. But again, I'm interested in the fact that once somebody shows that something can be done, there is such a difference in the attitude and then the behavior of other people. And I'm talking here purely of the human realm. I'm not even at this stage introducing the faith, but I'd like to, and I'd like us to do it together. So 1 Samuel is what you'll be needing. 1 Samuel chapter 13, and I want to look at a story. When I was a kid, I loved the books of Samuel and Kings because they were just full of stories and some really violent stories. And as a young kid, that was always kind of interesting. So 1 Samuel 13 and verse 5. And here we have a story about the Israelites under pressure. Under pressure from a nation that for quite a period of time was a real thorn in their side. And verse 5 of 1 Samuel 13 says, the Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots. Some versions you'll notice will say 30,000, but 3,000 probably makes sense given there were 6,000 charioteers. Soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Aven. When the men of Israel saw their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks, and in pits and cisterns. So you and I know a bit about the Philistines if we've read a little bit in the New Testament. We see this nation that we would view as just being heathen, barbaric, and just constantly annoying God's people. The reality is they were one of the most technologically advanced people of this era. You can see their place where they camped out just along the coastline, along that little red area that you see there. And they actually weren't from that region. They were an import. I guess a bit like the Israelites had moved there. They themselves had shifted there roundabout, historians say, roundabout the 12th century. And they've come across some burial pits in old Philistia, and they have done genetic testing of some of the remains. And they've discovered that indeed they just do not come from that area. The genetic background is of Crete or Greek background. And they were known, they were just simply referred to by the Egyptian people as the seafaring people. They were the boat people who would travel and find opportune places where they could establish their presence. As you can see from this picture here, Crete tended to be, although it looked like from history that those up in the Greece area and Crete area that they worked together. So both genetic pools were found in the old burial site. And you can see that the Israelites weren't the only people that they picked on. They loved to settle in along trading routes where they could enrich themselves. And when they were attacking the Israelites, they really weren't intending to come far inland. That really didn't suit them. But if they could gain wealth and gain goods and additional power in a region, they would do that. There's also evidence that although perhaps archaeologists think there were only about 30,000 of them living there, that was dependent on the year and the time, because they would bring troops, it appears, from other areas where they had settlements and reinforce settlements whenever they needed to. They worship Baal, Asherah, and one of the first ancient civilizations that actually divided their towns into domestic and industrial areas. Two main industries in Philistia was cloth dyeing and wine. So a lot of grapes were grown there. Round about the 7th century BC, they disappeared from history. The Assyrian Empire came through, either wiped them out or absorbed them, and they became no more. There is one particular aspect, however, that is important to our story, and that is that they were the first nation in history that we know of that actually developed steel rather than iron. So they learnt that by leaving iron in the fire, burning with wood, the carbon would get absorbed at the right temperature, and you'd end up with something very different from iron. You'd have steel. And the very first nation that they know of who outfitted their army with steel weapons rather than iron. And ancient war historians say that that in itself was as big a change in weaponry as was the invention of gunpowder. And they kept that technology to themselves for as long as they could. Of course, other people eventually developed that technology. So you don't just have a massive force, but you have people who are armed with weapons that are just far in advance of anything that the Israelites had. And of course, they had around 3,000 of these. Now, they haven't found any whole Philistine chariots. They certainly have from Egypt, and this one is an Egyptian one. They have discovered, however, that it looks like the Philistine chariots were very similar to the Egyptian ones. They had 6-spoke wheels and were made of light materials. They didn't build iron or steel chariots. And although it sounds from the scripture here, 6,000 charioteers and 3,000, it sounds like 2 per chariot. Traditionally, the Philistines would have a team of 3. 1 person to drive and 2 people with spears. Different from the Egyptian, who would have 1 spearman and 1 with a bow and arrow. Evidently, the Philistines rated the spear more important, so they'd have 3 on the back, 1 facing each side with the spear. And it was a game changer, these sorts of chariots, because you could race a contingent of people from one side of the battlefield to the other. And taking on chariots is the same today as infantry taking on tanks. It's just, it's suicide. So nations would make sure that they had their set of chariots. So here we have such an uneven contest. Let's just read a little bit more. So 1 Samuel 13, we're going to go to verse 15 because it gets worse. Then Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah in Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered how many? 600. Verse 19, not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords and spears. So all the Israelites went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. Have a look at verse 22. So on the day of battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. I'm just wondering what chances we would rate them. 600. And they're up against an army as many as the sand on the seashore. And there's 3,000 of those battle tanks. And they've got steel weapons. And a really limited, just a couple of people who have weaponry. What did the others have? Did they bring their spades and forks and what? Maybe their slings. We know they were good with their slings. But the most uneven contest that you can imagine. My background is that of a school teacher, and one of the creative writing things we would do with the students when we're doing English is, we'd tell them the first half of a story, and then we'd ask as a creative writing for the children to finish it off. And I don't mean to sort of, put people in any particular groups, but I did notice no matter what the story beginning, the boys in my class could always think of a violent ending. It's just amazing. And the girls would come up. There was always a romance that it all finished with for the girls. So when I was marking their work at the end of the day, I would always do the boys first, get all that out of the road, and then read them, the really nice, pretty ones after. But I'm just wondering if I gave this to the kids and asked them to write the ending from the beginning that I've told you, what would the ending look like if they didn't already know the story? I mean, what ending would you write if we turn this into a creative writing exercise? I would probably, my one might look a little bit boring, my ending to the story, because I think I would go something like this. Well, fortunately, the week before, Saul had been to a PD on leadership development. And he had learned all about context analysis, analyzing the environment. And so he stopped, and with the men in the cave, he set up his whiteboard, and together they did a SWOT analysis. And they looked at the strengths and the weaknesses and the opportunities and the threats, and they talked, and the board meeting went on for some time. And then at the end of it, the solution was go and bargain with them. What do they want? 20 talents of gold, we'll do it. 30 talents of gold, let's just get them out of our hair. I know it's a very boring ending, really. But there was someone else in the story who had a different idea of what the ending would be. And it was someone who didn't have the same ceiling that Saul had. In his mind, no ceiling existed. And he was ready to do something completely different. Let's come to it. 1 Samuel chapter 14 and verse 6, just one chapter on. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised fellows. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf." This amazing sentence. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. There's no ceiling in his mind. If God wants to do this, if this is God's will and his work, then he's going to work, whether we have a big army or just a few. Luckily, he had an armor bearer who had the same faith as him. "Do all you have in mind," his armor bearer said. "Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul." Verse 8, Jonathan said, "Come then, we will cross over towards the men and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come up to you,' we will stay and not go up to them. But if they say to us, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So it wasn't just a presumptuous faith. "Oh, we think this is a great idea." It was a prayerful faith. "God, are you leading here?" We don't want to lead ourselves. As humans, we're great at self-deception. But putting it in the hands of a God who is able to guide, he promises in Psalm 32:8, "I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you and watch over you." Verse 11, so both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us. We'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up, using hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. At that moment, the destiny of Israel changed. And the people were able to see what happens, what it looks like when somebody totally relying on God looks past the human resources and believes what is possible when God is there and in control and able to exercise his power. Just as we discussed with the story of Roger Bannister and the 4-minute mile and the climbing of Everest, it is really interesting to see what happens after the story. We often look at the story of David and Goliath and see that as that pivotal moment, and sure it is. But that story actually comes after this one. That's a few chapters on. In other words, what I see here is Jonathan showing what faith in God will do, that ceiling being broken. And I believe that formed an example for what David believed was possible later on. I read a headline, and this was in the New York Times just a little bit earlier this year. And it grabbed my attention because it said, the world is facing a perfect storm. And as I read that article, it was not a religious article, but just commenting on world events and the fear that people have in regards to things that appear to be out of our human control. And I realized if there was ever a time needed where people look beyond the human and grasp hold of the hand of faith, it's now. Never was there a time in history more needed for those like Jonathan and his armor bearer. A few years ago, 25 years ago actually, I put together just 2 quotes and laminated it and put it beside my desk, and that way I could lean back now and again and just have a read. This is the page that I have. The first is a famous quote by Theodore Roosevelt. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasm, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. And below it, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. It reminds me of another quote that I believe ties in very closely with it. It's from the book Evangelism. God will have men who will venture anything and everything to save souls. Those who will not move until they can see every step of the way clearly before them will not be of advantage at this time to forward the truth of God. There must be workers now who will push ahead in the dark as well as in the light, and who will hold up bravely under discouragements and disappointed hopes, and yet work with faith, with tears and patient hope, sowing beside all waters, trusting the Lord to bring the increase. God calls for men of nerve, of hope, of faith and endurance. And it's you and I that he calls. It's you and I that he invites to look beyond the human to what is possible, to be ready for his leading, to be ready to follow when he opens up the doors, though the way may seem impossible. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God.